I would first like to say how honored I am to be included in this conference, located here on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. I'm a fourth-generation settler on these lands, and as such, it is my responsibility to educate myself and those around me about this land's history and legacy of colonialism. As more and more graves have been located at residential schools throughout Canada, I have reflected on my education and teaching practices. I acknowledge how our school systems, among many other institutions, have failed us spectacularly, but especially those who suffered in residential schools. Learning and developing our understanding has the ability to heal and prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. I expect to learn a lot from the speakers at this conference, and in turn, I hope my talk on the power of multiple narratives will shed some small light on the power of deconstructing and challenging grand narratives, like colonialism, to make possible a more equitable future for us all. Adaptations. They're comforting yet novel, familiar and traditional but malleable and transformative too. Some of our earliest interactions with adaptations come from fairy tales, stories that transcend years and generations and change with time. Yet despite the changes to a narrative, all renderings of a story share the same DNA. Pick any Disney film and compare it to its original source, and it becomes quite obvious how adaptable stories can be. Tales, like any storytelling, survive by reacting and evolving to re-engage and frame narratives within the current context of audiences. Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, is an excellent example of the malleability of storytelling. Perhaps fittingly, the title even suggests a sort of fairy tale, though the subject and tone of Atwood's novel is firmly planted in the dystopian genre. It is the story of a woman's attempt to survive as a two-legged womb in an oppressive theocratic society known as Gilead, set in the near future of the United States. The novel has been transformed into film, opera, radio, audiobook, and most recently a television series. Given this impressive list of adaptations, Atwood's novel proves that audiences are invested in the protagonist Offred's story because it remains timely through the decades. At the heart of this novel is a mirror that reflects back aspects of North America's socio-political concerns, societal fears, and the moral navigation of them. More specifically, The Handmaid's Tale and all its adaptations highlight the universal need to revisit stories and to recontextualize them to fit modern ideas, anxieties, and creative outlets. The most recent adaptation of Atwood's novel is a television series which captures this process most impressively. Though there are many seasons now, I examined the first season of Hulu's The Handmaid's Tale because it most closely aligns with the novel's plot. Indeed, the worlds of Gilead in the television series and Atwood's novel have many terrifying similarities, but the distinct deviations made by the series creates a Gilead that more accurately reflects the concerns of the 21st century. This adaptation is not simply a retelling of Atwood's story. It reframes the dystopian material from the novel into reality as we know it. One contributing factor to The Handmaid's Tale's adaptability comes from the ambiguity found within Atwood's narrative. For instance, Atwood is careful not to proclaim that the pre- and post-Gileadian societies are any better than Gilead itself. She achieves this assertion through wordplay, fragmented passages, and the novel's rejection of absolute truths. These techniques avoid the rigidity of Gileadian ideology and the patriarchy more generally. Atwood's evasive and playful language instead leaves room for interpretation, multiple meanings, and by extension, hope in an otherwise bleak world. Ambiguity, then, lends itself easily to adaptation because it creates multiple narratives and possibilities to explore and develop. Consider the novel's protagonist, Offred. Her own name offers more than one meaning. She is Offred, indicating that she is property of her commander, as well as Offred, which suggests a resistance to her role as a handmaid. After all, the very uniform she wears is a bright red dress. Still, it is Offred's observations and language that best highlight the difficulty and freedom of ambiguity in language as well as in society. For instance, when considering the seemingly innocuous word chair, Offred remarks that, quote, it can also mean the leader of a meeting, it can also mean a mode of execution, It is the first syllable in charity. It is the French word for flesh. None of these facts has any connection with the others. These are the kinds of litanies I use to compose myself. Offred highlights the hidden potential terror and ambiguity in the word chair, and invites readers to extend this interpretation to the larger context of civilization. In post-Gileadian society, the wordplay of chair once again emerges through a transcript taken from the 12th Symposium on Gileadian Studies in the year 2195. Not only does the word connect the two civilizations, but it highlights the little progress that has been made since Offred made those first observations. In fact, the keynote speaker, Dr. James Darcy Pajito, implies sexual gratification when speaking of the symposium's chair, Professor Marianne Crescent Moon. Quote, "I am sure we all enjoyed our charming Arctic char last night at dinner, and now we are enjoying an equally charming Arctic chair. I use the word enjoy in two distinct senses, precluding, of course, the obsolete third." End quote. In his examination of language in The Handmaid's Tale, Dominic M. Grace points out the results of wordplay in both Offred's and Dr. Pajito's contexts. Quote, "While Offred insists on the multiple yet distinct meanings the word carries, Pajito plays on the multiple meanings of the word chair to collapse them, thus making a sexual and sexist pun at the expense of Marianne Crescent Moon." End quote. Despite a significant jump into the future, Pajito's remark reveals that the world is still suspiciously patriarchal and misogynistic towards women. Indeed, his combined demeanor, methods, and position of authority represent a kind of recycling of the toxic patterns that led to the Republic of Gilead in the first place. Pajito is demeaning towards Marianne Crescent Moon and Offred. He's less interested in Offred's narrative than he is in discovering the true identity of the commander. He is responsible for the naming, ordering, and assigning meaning to Offred's story, and his excuses for the rise of Gilead point towards a personal and societal blindness. Grace argues that Gileadian atrocities will continue if readers take Pajito's approach and continue to, quote, contextualize, compartmentalize, and historicize them in order to avoid judging them, end quote. In other words, dystopian societies become realities when individuals avoid critical engagement with dominant narratives and practices. Whether intentional or not, adaptations challenge dominant narratives by virtue of their existence. In her book, A Theory of Adaptation, Linda Hutcheon points out that, quote, adaptation is repetition, but repetition without replication, and there are manifestly many different possible intentions behind the act of adaptation. The urge to question and erase the memory of the adapted text, or call it into question, is as likely as the desire to pay tribute by copying, end quote. In the case of adaptations of The Handmaid's Tale, for example, creators have taken many liberties with the narrative. Endings have changed, Offred's personality and motivations have transformed, and deviations from the text are boundless. Yet, what is important here is that these adaptations mutated to fit their creative form and their time, both performance and real time. Hutcheon argues that we can view adaptations in the same vein as human genes adapting to environmental conditions. Quote, stories do get retold in different ways in new material and cultural environments. Like genes, they adapt to those new environments by virtue of mutation, in their offspring or their adaptations. And the fittest do more than survive. They flourish, end quote. Adapted stories, then, must not only consider new possibilities for the original work, but also the adaptation's creative limitations, environment, and audience expectations. Navigating these factors requires a great deal of skill and self-awareness, but when adaptations achieve success despite these potential barriers, they, like mutated genes, thrive. In the case of Atwood's novel, not all adaptations have been successful in their retelling. Take, for instance, Volker Schlondorff's 1990 film The Handmaid's Tale. Though his film had a dazzling cast of actors and a Nobel Prize-winning screenwriter, it ultimately suffered from critical and economic disappointment. One glaring reason for its failure is that it was subjected to the confines of Hollywood patriarchal storytelling. Take, for instance, how the film rejects Atwood's deliberately ambiguous ending for one that fits the stereotypical Hollywood happy ending. Indeed, Kate, as she is known in the film, assassinates the commander, escapes Gilead, and is seen in the final shots of the film pregnant and hopeful that she will one day find her lover Nick and her daughter. The ending feels contrived and too easily achieved given the extreme oppressiveness of the regime. In his introduction to reading movies, Peter McKinnon argues that this kind of finale, quote, reinscribes a patriarchal, heterosexual ideology based on hegemony of reproductive sexuality, something that the novel seems to challenge at every turn. It is important to note that the novel's ending is neither ideologically nor narratively so absolute, end quote. Atwood's endings, one involving Offred's narrative and the other in historical notes, showcase intentional ambiguity. In Offred's story, she continually challenges readers with her uncertainty, doubleness, and vagueness. Her final lines echo this theme, quote, "Whether this is my end or new beginning, I have no way of knowing. I have given myself over into the hands of strangers because it can't be helped. And so I step up into the darkness within, or else the light." End quote. Whether Offred escapes to Canada with the help of Nick, or if he is betrayed her remains unknown. Her words suggest both endings and beginnings, darkness and light, safety and death. Similarly, in the historical notes, Pajito says in addressing the academic conference, quote, "Voices may reach us from it, but what they say to us is imbued with the obscurity of the matrix out of which they come. And try as we may, we cannot always decipher them precisely in the clearer light of our own day. Are there any questions?" End quote. Of course, readers are left to ponder many unanswered questions about Offred, Gilead, and the trustworthiness of Pajito himself. These undecided endings are not neat nor offer stability. Instead, they invite readers to question Offred's and Pajito's narratives, and by extension, our own overarching narratives. The film, on the other hand, does not use cinematic elements to enhance this important theme. Instead, it falls into the trap of typical Hollywood storytelling and offers a neat and happy ending that seems at best misplaced and at worst a gross neglect of the central themes of the novel. Perhaps most problematic with Schlondorf's film is that it fails to recognize the invasion of the physical and metaphorical camera eye in an already highly surveillance society. Pamela Cooper's article, Sexual Surveillance and Medical Authority in Two Versions of The Handmaid's Tale, explores this problem. She writes, "To film The Handmaid's Tale is to duplicate the threatening strategies of visual surveillance that persecute the women depicted in the novel. It is to force the audience's complicity by identifying the inherent voyeurism of movie watching with the invasive examining of the disenfranchised by the dictatorial which the novel portrays. The very act of filming The Handmaid's Tale automatically shifts the issue of surveillance-enforced misogyny to a metafictional or metacinematic level." End quote. Like the novel's police organization called The Eyes, movie viewers become voyeurs whose surveillance Kate's every move. In fact, the camera's perspective remains steady on her, but never offers any angles from her perspective. Cooper notes, quote, "In this way, the movie seals and implicitly endorses the terms of that contract so vehemently questioned in the novel between totalitarianism and the gaze," end quote. Where the novel dedicates so much to Offred's interiority, Schlondorf's film upholds the barrier between audience and protagonist. Since viewers are forced to passively accept the role as omniscient viewers, there is an unavoidable irony at play throughout the film. In the first season of the television adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale, the camera is used in a decidedly different way because it recognizes the creative potentials available through film to tell a new version of Offred's tale without compromising the central themes of the novel. Where Schlondorf's camera enforced a voyeuristic approach, the television series uses the camera to create a sense of intimacy between the audience and Offred. It is no coincidence that the camera is repeatedly inches away from Offred's face, detecting every slight movement in her eyes and facial muscles. By studying the face of Offred so intimately, viewers are bound to shift their perspective from voyeur to close confidant. Video essayist Evan Pushak explains how this transformation occurs. It's hard to remember a show that relied so much on one extreme close-up, but Elizabeth Moss, who plays Offred, is definitely up to the task. With a camera near inches from her nose, the filmmakers combined a wide 28mm Zeiss lens, used only for these shots, with a shallow depth of field to create an intense intimacy. With her bonnet on, it's almost as if we are under a blanket with the character." End quote. It is this connection to Offred that allows audiences to conspire with her against Gilead rather than towards her. Evan Pushak also points out how the series' filming techniques expresses the limited information available in Gilead. Apart from the commanders, everyone is prohibited from reading books or accessing the internet under Gilead's regime. As a result, the women living in this totalitarian state have extremely limited knowledge and perspectives. The camera echoes this notion through the shallow depth of field because, quote, "it literally narrows the visual information in focus," end quote. Compare this kind of creative technique to that of Schlondorff's traditional placement of the camera, and it's clear that the television series better captured the themes of oppression, ambiguity, and uncertainty that are central to The Handmaid's Tale. One stark contrast between the series and the novel is Offred's rebellious nature. In Atwood's tale, Offred is passive, paralyzed by fear and complacent in her role as handmaid. In reference to the protests that took place before Gilead seized control, she says, quote, "I didn't go on to any of the marches. Luke said it would be futile, and I had to think about them, my family, him and her," end quote. She also refuses to spy on the commander despite Offred's request. In their exchange, Offred says, quote, "I can't. I'm too afraid. Anyway, I'd be no good at that. I'd get caught." And then to herself, "I scarcely take the trouble to sound regretful. So lazy have I become." End quote. While her fear and complacency are understandable, she is sometimes cowardly. As readers, we feel trapped in her mind, just as she is trapped in Gilead. By contrast, Offred in the series is more rebellious than her literary counterpart. Her internal and external voices are strikingly opposite. Creator Bruce Miller said of this choice that he, quote, "thought it would be more interesting to create a large gap between Offred's internal and external monologues. Internally, she's indignant. Externally, she's obedient. And frankly, the change makes her a more likable character," end quote. Atwood recognizes this too. When asked about the series version of Offred, she said, quote, "The Hulu team made their Offred more active than my Offred, partly because it's a television series, and partly because it's an American television series," end quote. Perhaps some of that American heroism diminishes the horror that is felt so deeply in the novel. Yet the show is able to depict a horror that feels visually and politically so close to home for many. For Americans, perhaps even more frighteningly so. It is this anxious thread, that slip into a totalitarian nightmare, that runs through all the adaptations of The Handmaid's Tale. This angst is justified because, as Atwood points out in her novel, every horror in Gilead has already occurred in history. As concerning political ideologies have recycled their way back into the mainstream, it's no surprise why we continually revisit Atwood's novel. Certainly, some adaptations have been more successful in invigorating the tale without losing its DNA. Ultimately, however, what these works demonstrate is that storytelling is fluid and responsive to different creative forms, time periods, cultures, and experiences. Just as Offred suggests that no one narrative is absolute, adaptations prove that no one telling of a story is necessarily sufficient. At the heart of adaptations is the fundamentally postmodern idea that stories must be shared, but nevertheless treated as another piece to the puzzle, not the puzzle itself. Or perhaps, in the context of The Handmaid's Tale, a Scrabble board is more appropriate. Just as Offred builds and connects words on the game board, so must we approach stories, and by extension, adaptations, with the knowledge that there is always more than one way.